I have no choice but to suspend you, pending a full internal review. Please collect your things, Maya.
She didn't say anything inappropriately.
Who are you?
My name is Claire Whitfield. I serve as executive assistant to James Whitfield, founder and principal owner of Alara Group. The agreed price for that package was $200,000. The exchange was scheduled for tonight.
You constructed this. You can't just...
And the alarm went off at 5:47 a.m. Not 5:45, not 6:0, 5:47. Because Maya Reeves had learned somewhere in the space between her 20s and now that waking at an odd number felt less brutal, and, like the universe was offering a 13-minute grace period before everything started again. It didn't help. It never helped. She lay there for 4 seconds and counted them, and stared at the ceiling of her one-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor of a building that smelled like other people's cooking and old carpet, and the radiator knocked twice, stopped, knocked again. Like it was checking. She was still there. She sat up, feet on the floor. Cold hardwood. She didn't flinch. She'd stopped flinching at cold floors 3 years ago. Around the same time, she'd stopped flinching at a lot of things. And the kitchen was small enough that she could touch both counters if she stretched her arms. 4 feet, 8 inches. She knew this because her brain collected measurements the way other people collected regrets. And quietly, without being asked. Building a record she hadn't requested and couldn't stop, the coffee maker had started on its own. She'd set the timer the night before. She poured a cup and sat at the table. 2 chairs, both hers. Nobody else sat at this table anymore. And in front of her, 3 envelopes she hadn't opened. She knew what was inside each one. The envelope from Atlanta General had a red stripe across the top right corner. The 2 from the credit company had the same stripe. And overdue, overdue, overdue. Raymond had died on a Thursday. She remembered that specifically, not because Thursday was special, and because she'd been at work when it happened, and the hostess had come to find her between tables with a face people make when they're about to change the shape of someone's life. And Maya had still been holding a water pitcher, and she'd thought, before the woman even opened her mouth, I need to set this down first, so I don't drop it. And she'd set it down, carefully, on the nearest tray stand. And then the hostess had said the words, and Maya had nodded, and then walked to the break room, and sat on the bench for exactly 4 minutes, and then walked back out and finished her shift. And not because she didn't love him, she did, but she had rent due in 11 days, and no one was going to pay it for her. And Raymond had died on a construction site without life insurance. And she was the only thing standing between the life they'd built together and the wreckage it could become. And so she finished her shift. The next day, she started calling hospitals about payment plans. 3 years later, the red stripes kept showing up. She drank her coffee without tasting it. Her phone buzzed on the counter. Deja, her little sister, 20 years old, and first year at Georgia State. The scholarship covered 60%. Maya covered the rest. Had been covering it since September. Would cover it through May, because that was what she'd promised their grandmother, and Maya did not break promises, and she let it ring, not because she didn't want to talk to her. She loved Deja the way you love the one person who still needs you to be standing when everything else is trying to knock you down. But Deja would ask about the tuition payment, and Maya hadn't done the math this week, and on purpose. Because sometimes not knowing a number for a few more days was the only way to keep moving forward without stopping in the middle of the road. And she didn't want to lie. She didn't want Deja to feel guilty. And the only remaining option was honesty, which would do exactly that. The call went to voicemail. Maya stared at the phone for a moment. Then she got up and ironed her uniform. Black shirt, black skirt, black apron, and her grandmother used to call it the holy trinity of invisibility. You wear all black in a room full of color, and you become the furniture, she'd say. People say anything around furniture, and her grandmother had been a maid for 31 years. She'd known things about people that most therapists would charge $200 an hour to learn. Maya braided her hair back, checked her reflection for 2 seconds. Enough to confirm she looked professional, and not enough to start thinking about whether she looked tired. And because she knew she looked tired, and there was nothing to be done about it. And then thinking about it would only make the shift feel longer, and she picked up her bag and walked out. And the bus was half full. Saturday morning, early riders. A man in a security guard uniform sleeping against the window with his chin on his chest, and a woman's in scrubs staring at her phone with the expression of someone who'd already put in 10 hours before most people finished breakfast. An older gentleman near the back holding a folded newspaper like a prop, the pages slightly damp from the morning air, and Maya found a seat by the window and looked out, and the city moved past in the gray early light. Storefronts still shuttered. A man sweeping the sidewalk in front of a barber shop, moving the broom in slow, even arcs like he had nowhere else to be, and a woman standing at a bus stop across the street, eyes down on her phone, not watching the bus pulling away without her. Maya almost said something. Didn't. She turned back to the window, and this was the thing about Maya Reeves that most people never figured out, even people who'd worked beside her for years. And she watched everything, not with suspicion, with attention. And she'd grown up in the kind of neighborhood where reading a room, and reading a street, and reading a face before the face finished deciding what it was going to do, and was the difference between fine and not fine. And her father had been an electrician. He used to say, "You can't fix what you haven't diagnosed. Don't assume. Look first." She looked. At the man with the newspaper, who was holding it upside down and hadn't noticed, and at the woman in scrubs who had a tension around her jaw that came from not sleeping, not from concentration, at her own faint reflection in the bus window, and a 34-year-old black woman in a black uniform on a Saturday morning, going to a job that paid her enough to survive and not quite enough to breathe. She blinked. The reflection blinked back. She looked away first. Elara's sat on the corner of Peachtree and Fifth like it had always been there and had always intended to be there, and dark steel and floor-to-ceiling glass. A gold script sign above the entrance that was too restrained to be flashy and too expensive to be modest. The kind of building that made you adjust your posture before you stepped inside, whether you were a guest or not. And Maya had stopped adjusting her posture in the third month of year 1. She clocked in at 4:47. Shift started at 5. Derek liked people early, and not because he valued punctuality, not genuinely, but because early arrival gave him time to find things to criticize before service began. And warm-up reps, she'd decided. The man needed warm-up reps. The pre-service briefing happened at 5:15 in the passage between the kitchen and the dining room that everyone on staff called the alley. 10 employees in a loose cluster, and Maya stood near the back where she could see the whole group. Derek walked in at 5:16, navy suit, white pocket square, shoes so polished she could see the overhead light fixtures reflected in the toe caps, and he was 44 years old and had the energy of a man who had decided, and sometime in his late 30s, and that he would become the kind of person who made other people nervous, and had worked at it with genuine discipline ever since. And he was good at it. She'd give him that. He scanned the group the way a teacher scans a classroom, looking for the student who seems least prepared, because that was the most efficient place to apply pressure before anyone had their guard fully up. His gaze moved across faces, and landed on Tobias for half a second, moved on. "Tonight we have VIP reservations at tables 3 and 11, Derek said. His voice was smooth, practiced, the voice of someone who had rehearsed warmth until it became indistinguishable from the real thing, and response time under 90 seconds on every request. Water stays above the halfway mark. If you're refilling a glass, you're already behind. Nobody moved. Alara's guests don't come here to eat, he continued. They come here to be seen. Your job is to make them feel worth seeing. And visible professionalism. If a guest remembers your face at the end of the night, you've done something wrong. Invisible professionalism." Maya had been turning those two words over for 4 years, and how they were supposed to sound like a standard, how they actually worked as something else. Permission to treat the people serving as props. Permission to make them disappear while still requiring them to perform. Derek finished the logistics, menu updates, and the sommelier was out sick, so wine questions went to the bar. Table assignments were on the board. He dismissed them with a small backward wave that managed to be both casual and dismissive in equal measure. Maya turned to go, and Williams. She stopped, gave herself one breath, then turned back. Derek was looking at her with the expression he used when he was about to tell someone something he'd already decided on, not discussing, announcing. "Table 9 is yours tonight. Keep the floor moving." Table 9, and she knew table 9. Everyone on staff knew Table 9. Corner position, tight against the kitchen pass-through, and when the back delivery door swung open, and outside air came in with it, and in warmer months, and when the kitchen ran hot and the service alley dumpsters were full, and there was occasionally a drift of something that had no business accompanying a $250 meal. And it was the table they used for people they wanted to feel unwelcome. Of course, Maya said. Derek nodded. Like she'd done him a favor. She walked to the floor. Tobias Price was already at his station running through the knife check when she came through, and he was 30 years old and broad through the shoulders, and with the kind of hands that moved in the kitchen, like they had their own intelligence, and separate from the rest of him, and fast and deliberate and always exactly right. And he'd been at Alara's for 2 years and was better than this place deserved. He'd told her once on a slow Tuesday, when they'd both ended up on break at the same time, that Derek had covered a repair bill for him last year. An equipment problem. $2,800, and Derek had run it through a main account and kept it off Tobias's record. Maya had nodded when he told her. She'd understood what that was before he finished the sentence. And it wasn't a favor, it was a leash. The kind that didn't chafe until you tried to move. She hadn't said that. They'd sat in silence for a minute, and then the break was over and they'd both gone back to work. That was how most things operated here, and you understood something clearly, and you didn't say it out loud, and you went back to doing what needed doing. She checked her station, napkins folded, silverware aligned, order pad in the apron pocket, and she moved through the opening tasks with her hands while her eyes did something else. She watched Derek move through the dining room. He stopped at the bar, spoke to the bartender briefly, checked his phone, and moved to the host stand and said something to Renee, who nodded too quickly, the way someone nods when they want to seem agreeable and don't want the conversation to continue. Renee was 26 and 2 months into the job and still figuring out how to handle Derek, and Maya had watched her learn to make herself smaller around him. It happened gradually. You almost didn't notice until one day you looked and the person was half the size they'd been when they started. The dinner service opened at 6. For the first hour, it was the usual rhythm, and couples and corporate groups and a birthday party at the back corner that ordered champagne in 3 separate rounds and laughed at a volume the room tolerated because they were clearly spending enough. And Maya moved through it with the automatic competence of someone who had done this long enough that the body handled it while the mind went elsewhere. Fill the glass, take the order, smile at eye level, appear at the right moment and disappear between them. She was good at it, and she'd always been good at it, and she had complicated feelings about being good at it, the way you sometimes have complicated feelings about a skill you never chose. 7:03 p.m., and the front door opened. Maya was 3 tables away, checking on a couple who'd been sitting with empty bread baskets for longer than she should have let go. She heard the shift in the room before she saw its cause, a half-beat of dropped conversation, not loud, and just a pause, the way a room pauses when something unexpected enters it, and then everyone resuming slightly louder to compensate. She looked toward the entrance. A man stood just inside the door, and he was tall, broad through the shoulders in a way that the clothes didn't suit. The jacket he wore was dark brick brown, faded to a color that didn't have a clean name anymore, the elbows worn pale. His pants were dark and creased in the wrong places, and his right shoe had worn through at the front of the sole. His face was lined, his beard several days past any intention, and he carried with him the smell of the street, and not aggressively, not overwhelmingly, but unmistakably. Renee had frozen at the host stand with her hands on the podium, and her smile technically in place but everything behind it suspended. And Curtis, the security guard near the entrance, and a man Maya had always respected for the simple reason that he was never unkind to anyone without a reason, and had taken 1 step forward and then stopped, and, because the man hadn't done anything, hadn't spoken, hadn't moved in any direction that required responding to, and he had walked in and stopped and looked around. That was the first thing Maya noticed, not the jacket, not the shoes, the way he looked around. Most people who walked into Alara's did one of 2 things, and they either scanned the room with the easy confidence of someone who belonged here and knew it, or they took it in with a kind of hungry admiration, cataloging what their money was buying. Both of those had a recognizable shape, a particular angle of the head, and a softness around the eyes. This man looked around like he was taking inventory, methodical, unhurried, moving from one section to another with the focus of someone checking off items on a list inside his head. And the items weren't the chandeliers or the floral arrangements or the ambient lighting. He was looking at something underneath all of that, something structural. His eyes didn't move the way a lost man's eyes moved, and they moved the way a man's eyes moved when he already knew exactly where he was, and was confirming that what he'd expected was what he found. And Derek appeared from the direction of the bar. He crossed the floor in long, even strides. 11 steps. Maya counted them without deciding to. "Sir," the warm voice, and the voice Derek reserved for investors and critics and situations that needed to be dissolved without visible effort. Concerned, professionally apologetic, slightly regretful that things had come to this. "I'm afraid there may be some confusion here, and Alara's is a reservation-only establishment, and this evening, the man reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, and slowly, without hurrying, without looking at Derek, he placed a stack of folded bills on Renee's podium. Not small, not theatrical, just present, the kind of stack that made its point without needing to announce itself. "Table 9, the man said, "and dry-aged prime ribeye. Medium rare, I'll pay now." The room near the entrance went quiet. Derek looked at the money, looked at the man, looked at the money again. Maya watched the calculation move behind his eyes, and, because Derek Mason was many things, most of them unpleasant, but he was not stupid. He understood the rule that governed every moment like this one in every restaurant that had ever had a moment like this one. You do not refuse a paying customer in front of witnesses, and not in this industry, not with 6 staff members in range in a dining room full of the people who carried smartphones and opinions and time to post both. "Of course," Derek said, and the smile that followed cost him nothing and was designed to look like it cost him something. He led the man across the dining room to table 9. Maya watched the route, watched Derek place him in the corner, facing the kitchen door, back to the room, and the seat that caught the draft when the delivery entrance opened. The seat that was positioned to make a person feel like they'd been filed away rather than received. The man sat down, and that was the second thing. He sat with his back straight and his hands resting on the table, and his gaze moving across the room with the same methodical attention he'd brought through the front door. Not uncomfortable, not grateful for being accommodated, and not performing ease to compensate for the situation, just present. The stillness of someone who had been in many rooms and had long since stopped needing to prove anything to any of them. Maya had seen that stillness once before, and in her grandmother on an evening she still thought about sometimes. Her grandmother had been sitting in her good chair, the one she kept by the window, and she'd had that quality about her. That complete and considered stillness, and the stillness of a decision already made, and now simply waiting for the right moment to be acted on. This man was waiting for something. She picked up the water pitcher and walked to his table. "Good evening," she said, set the glass down, and poured, hands steady, face professional. He looked up at her, dark eyes, patient. They held something in them that she couldn't name immediately but recognized the shape of, the way you recognize weather before you can see it clearly, and some quality of having been through a thing and come out the other side of it and not forgotten what the middle felt like. "Thank you," he said. Just that. Not performing gratitude, not deflecting it, just acknowledging, the way a person acknowledges something real. And she handed him the menu and walked away, and she tried to understand why the back of her neck felt the way it did. 7:18 p.m., and Maya was at the station near the server corridor, refolding a napkin that was already folded, giving her hands something to do while her eyes stayed on the room. She heard Derek before she saw him, not his words, and his footsteps moving past the kitchen pass-through, angling toward the prep corridor. She heard the door, and she heard another set of footsteps follow and stop. The ventilation in this building had a quirk she'd discovered in her second week. Cold air came through from the kitchen side, and with it, sound traveled at angles the architects hadn't planned for. And from her position at the napkin station, voices from the far end of the prep corridor arrived at a specific angle, audible if the kitchen wasn't running loud. And the kitchen, and at 7:18, and was between rushes. And she kept her hands on the napkin, and then she listened. The ribeye for table 9, Derek's voice, low versational. Not a whisper, Derek didn't whisper. Whispering implied something to hide. He'd learned to say the things he needed to say in a normal indoor voice. Use the one from this afternoon, and the return from the lunch service. Silence. Tobias, that piece was left out. Before it went back in the cooler, yes. How long's was it out? 4 hours approximately. Another silence. And longer. Derek, that's not Tobias. And here it was. The other register. The one that came when the warmth had served its purpose and what lived underneath it was allowed to show. Not loud, just cold. And the way certain rooms are cold, not from wind, but from absence of something that should be there. The equipment repair. October. The invoice I ran through the main account. $2,800. Nothing. Brianna's due next month. You want to do the math on one income? The sound of something being moved in the kitchen. Metal on metal. He'll feel unwell. He'll leave. Derek again. Easy. Almost bored with the necessity of explaining it. Nobody pays attention to a complaint from a man like that. And think of it as the most comfortable meal he's had in weeks. Footsteps. Derek moving back toward the dining room. A pause. Then the softer, worse sound of someone returning to work. Maya set the napkin down. Her hands stayed still, and her heart did not. She ran the numbers the way her brain always ran numbers. Fast. Without sentiment. 4 hours at room temperature. She remembered the food safety certification she'd completed 3 years ago. The temperature ranges, the multiplication rates, and the outcomes that started with cramping and ended with something she didn't want to finish thinking about. Because she didn't know anything about the man at table 9, his age, his history, what was already happening in his body that she couldn't see, and nobody here knew anything about him. That was the point. Tobias came around the corner of the prep corridor and stopped when I saw her standing there. They looked at each other, and his face had the specific expression of a person who has just done something he knows is wrong and is continuing to do it anyway, and has built a temporary structure inside himself to get through the next few hours. She recognized it. She'd worn versions of it herself, and on smaller things, different stakes. He looked at her for 3 seconds. Once. Slow. Don't. He walked back into the kitchen. Maya stood where she was. 6 cameras in the main dining room, and she knew their positions the way she knew the layout of this building, the way she knew the particular sound the front door made versus the kitchen door, the way she knew which tables had uneven legs and which section of the floor creaked under a full tray, and through repetition, through the kind of attention that comes from working somewhere long enough that the place stops being a setting and starts being a system you navigate. Camera 1 above the bar, angled south. Camera 2 above the host stand. Camera 3 at the rear wall, and 4 through 6 at intervals along the ceiling, covering the central floor. The server corridor had 2. The kitchen had cameras at the line and the prep stations. The break room had 1 above the door, and 1 room in the entire building had no camera, the staff restroom. Derek had complained about it in Maya's first year. The owner at the time had cited privacy regulations. Derek had pushed. The owner had not moved, and that had been the end of it. Maya had noted it, and filed it under things that are useful to know. She walked toward the back corridor at a normal pace, the pace of someone checking supply inventory, which was a thing she sometimes did at this hour, which no one would question, and she pushed the restroom door open, turned the lock, leaned against the sink. The fluorescent light on in here was the unforgiving kind. It showed everything. The tiredness she managed to keep out of her face on the floor, the set of her jaw she'd been holding since the briefing, and the expression around her eyes she recognized as the one she wore when she was working something out and hadn't found the answer yet. She was working something out. The problem wasn't the decision, and she knew what she wanted to do. She'd known it standing in the corridor listening to Derek's voice. The problem was the math. If she walked out onto the floor and said something out loud, Derek would know before she reached the kitchen door. She'd be suspended and fired, more likely. And Derek had reach in this industry. He knew managers at other properties. He'd used it before on people who left on bad terms or were pushed out. She knew the names, and she'd heard the stories. No job meant no income. No income meant Deja's tuition payment didn't get made. No income meant the red striped envelopes on her kitchen table multiplied. She had 3 weeks of savings, and she'd calculated it once last year as a kind of emergency inventory. 3 weeks was her number. If she did nothing, the man at table 9 ate that food. and whatever happened to him happened, and she went home and paid her bills and called Deja back and kept her job and got up on Sunday morning and started over. And then she carried it, not in a dramatic way, not in the way people described in movies with the weight and the sleepless nights and the dramatic reckoning, in the quiet way and the dense sediment way where something settles at the bottom of you and changes the weight of everything you carry afterward. She thought about her mother. Her mother had been a nurse for 28 years and had worked the overnight ward at a hospital that underinvested in its staff and overinvested in its reputation, and had been told once by a supervising physician to alter a notation in a patient's chart. A small change, the kind that would protect the doctor and compromise the patient and be nearly impossible for anyone outside the room to trace. Her mother had refused and had documented the request, had been quietly, professionally, systematically edged toward the door over the following months, and had never said, and not once, and in any conversation Maya had with her before she got sick, and that she wished she'd made a different choice. And Maya thought about that. Then she reached into her apron pocket and pulled out the order pad. She tore off a piece smaller than a matchbook, found her pen, wrote quickly, 4 lines, plain words, nothing that required explanation. Don't eat, the meat is bad. Left out for hours, and they know. She looked at it for a moment, folded it twice, and until it fit in the cup of her palm, and invisible from above, and invisible to any camera, and invisible to anyone who wasn't standing inside her hand. Chand she it for a moment longer. Thought about Deja, about what she would say on the phone tonight if Maya called her back, about what she would ask. And Deja asked the same thing at the end of every call. Had been asking it since she was about 12 years old. Did you do something good today? Maya couldn't answer that question tonight the way she needed to answer it if she walked out of this room and did nothing. And she unlocked the door, walked out, 7:52 p.m. She came back through the kitchen the long way, past the line, moving at a pace that suggested purpose without urgency. Tobias was plating at his station. His hands were doing what his hands always did, clean, precise, and each element of the dish placed with the automatic accuracy of someone who'd performed the same motions thousands of times. The ribeye sat in the center of a white plate. It had been seared to a deep, even brown, and butter gathered at the edges. Roasted vegetables arranged to the left. A reduction sauce in a careful line across the lower third of the plate. It looked exactly like what it was supposed to look like. It smelled exactly like what it was supposed to smell like, and that was the particular cruelty of it. You couldn't see anything wrong. You couldn't smell it. The danger was invisible inside the thing that looked and smelled like a good meal. Maya stopped beside him, and he didn't look up. He reached for the saucepan. Tobias, no, still not looking up. If he has any underlying conditions, Maya, he set down the pan, kept his eyes on the plate. His voice was flat in the way that comes from a conversation you've already had with yourself and lost. And, you think I don't know what this is? You think I haven't been standing here for the last half hour thinking about exactly what you're about to say? And she didn't answer. Brianna can't work right now. His voice stayed even. Just facts. Quietly devastating facts. We've got maybe $400 between us and a month I don't know how to get through if I lose this job. And Derek has the invoice, and he's reminded me of it 3 times in the last 2 months. Just mentions it. Casually. Like it's nothing. Like he's just making conversation. I know. I'm not a bad person. And I know you're not. He stopped. Started again. Didn't finish. She understood what was in the space where the sentence stopped. She looked at him for a moment. You didn't hear anything tonight, she said quietly. You don't know anything. Go back to work. And he looked at her then. Really looked. And in his face she saw guilt and gratitude so tangled together they'd become one thing, and she didn't have time to separate them, and it wasn't her job to. And, don't do anything he can trace back to you, Tuba said. I won't. She picked up the plate. She carried it out of the kitchen and into the dining room. The room moved around her, and low music, the soft percussion of cutlery against china. The murmur of 40 people performing the particular theater of expensive Saturday evenings. She moved through it at the right speed, not fast, not slow, and the speed of someone doing exactly what they're supposed to be doing, unremarkable in every detail, because unremarkable was the point, and she folded her bread arm slightly, shifting the balance of the plate to her left hand. Her right hand dropped to her side, fingers loose around the paper, 6 steps to table 9. She set the plate down in front of him with both hands, straightened the angle, and moved the fork 1 inch to the right with her left hand. And as her right hand came to rest, for 1 fraction of a second against the edge of the table near where his left hand lay open beside the silverware, she let the paper slide from her palm to his, and his fingers closed, quiet, immediate, like he'd been ready. She straightened, picked up the empty water carafe she'd carried out as a prop. "Your ribeye, sir, medium rare, as requested. Enjoy your evening." She did not look at his face, and she turned and walked back toward her station. She didn't look back. Not because she wasn't afraid, Fu. She was. But looking back wouldn't change anything she'd just done, and it might change something on her face, and this was not the moment to let her face change. And she kept her eyes on the floor in front of her, and walked at the right speed and put the carafe back on the station, and picked up an order pad, and stood there with her pen ready, like she was waiting for something from the kitchen. And she waited. And James Whitfield sat at the worst table in the dining room and read the note twice. Then a third time. Not from confusion, from the specific rereading you do when something lands more precisely than you expected, and when words name what you'd been circling. He set both hands flat on the tablecloth, looked at the plate, the ribeye, perfectly presented, aromatic, the visual language of a very good meal. His left cuff had pulled back slightly when he'd rested his hands, and the scar on his wrist caught the low dining room light, pale against his skin, old enough to have softened at the edges. He was 23 when he got it, Atlanta, January, and he'd been hungry in the genuine and physical sense of the word, and past discomfort, and past urgency, and into the dull mechanical need that takes over when the body has stopped negotiating. And he'd been behind a restaurant not entirely unlike this one, going through what they'd put out. The back door had opened. He still remembered the sound of the door hitting the brick frame, and then heat, before pain. That was the particular physics of burns, and the heat arrived first. Then the understanding of what was happening. Then the sound he made, which he didn't remember making, but had been told about later by someone who'd heard it. Then the laughter, and he'd built a Lara group on one principle. Not the profit margins, not the star ratings, not the press coverage that came with opening a restaurant in the right city at the right moment with the right chef. Those were results. The principle was simpler and harder than any of them, and every person who walks through the door is treated with dignity. Not the guests who could afford the tasting menu. Every person. He'd held that line for 22 years across 12 restaurants in 5 cities. And tonight, in a building that carried his name, they'd prepared a plate of contaminated food and served it to a man they thought had no one to speak for him. James picked up the phone from beside the plate, and he'd set it there, face down, recording since before he walked through the front door. Claire and the legal team had the audio live through an open connection. He did not pick up the fork. He sat with his hands on the table and looked across the room, and she was at her station, standing with the order pad and the pen like she was waiting on the kitchen. Her face was perfectly composed, but her left hand, the one not holding the pen, was pressed flat against her thigh. She was afraid. She had done it anyway, and he pressed his thumb once against the side of the phone. 2 miles away, in a black SUV parked on the street outside, Claire Whitfield straightened in her seat. James set the phone back down and settled back in his chair, watched the room, and waited for whoever was going to make the next move. In his experience, they always made one. 20 minutes. That was how long the plate sat there untouched. The butter had stopped moving, the sear had lost its sheen, and the ribeye cooled on its white stage, and the man at table 9 sat with his back straight and his hands on the table and did not reach for the fork. Maya knew because she counted, and not consciously. Her brain logged the minutes the way it logged everything else, quietly, without permission, building a record she hadn't asked for. 12 minutes, Derek looked at table 9 from the bar. 14 minutes, he looked again, and 17 minutes, he set down his tablet. 20 minutes, he walked. She watched him cross the floor, that particular stride he used when a decision had already been made, and what remained was simply the execution, not hurried. Derek never moved fast, and fast looked reactive. Derek believed, above almost everything else, in looking composed. He stopped at the edge of table 9. "Sir." The warm voice. The voice that cost him nothing and was engineered to sound like it cost him something. Slightly concerned, and professionally regretful. I noticed your meal hasn't been touched. Is there a problem with the preparation? I can have the kitchen, the atmosphere, the man said. Derek stopped. I'm enjoying the atmosphere. The man's voice was even and unhurried. The food can wait. A pause. Maya watched Derek absorb this, watched the micro-adjustment behind his eyes, the recalculation, the arrival of something that wasn't quite concern but was shaped like it. Of course, Derek said. Take all the time you need. And he turned and walked away. But he didn't go back to the bar. He went toward the corridor, toward his office. And that was different. The bar was passive. The bar was watching. The office was active. And the office meant he was pulling up footage, reviewing, looking for the thing that explained why a man he'd expected to be gone 20 minutes ago was still at table 9, still not eating, completely still. And the only footage worth reviewing was from the moment she'd set the plate down. Her right hand at the edge of the table. The half-second that had looked like nothing. Maya set down the order pad she'd been holding and picked up a tray of empty glasses from a nearby table and gave her hands something to do, kept her face on her work, thought. How long do I have? Not long. She moved through the next 15 minutes on autopilot. Table 3 needed a second round of sparkling water. Table 7 had a question about the cheese course. And Table 11, a couple in their late 50s, had been sitting with dessert menus for long enough that she went to check without being flagged. Her hands did the work. Her mind stayed on the corridor door. And Derek came back out at 8:09. His face was exactly as it had been when he went in. That was the most dangerous thing about him. Most people, when they were adjusting to new information, showed it somewhere. The jaw, the pace of blinking, the angle of the shoulders, and Derek showed nothing. He had trained himself out of it the way certain people train themselves out of flinching. Through repetition. Through deciding that the display of recalibration was itself a form of weakness. And he went to the bar, picked up his tablet, reviewed something on it, set it back down. Then his eyes crossed the room, not to table 9, to Maya. 3 seconds, maybe 4. The look of someone who hadn't decided yet but was deciding. And the look that said, I see you, and I'm working out what I saw. She didn't hold it, didn't drop it either. Let it move over her, the way you let headlights move over you on a dark road. And you don't turn into them. You don't turn away. You keep walking in the same direction, and you don't give the light anything to catch. She turned to table 11 and asked about the dessert menu. 8:17 p.m. Derek's phone buzzed. She was close enough to the bar to hear it, and not the generic notification sound, a different tone, the kind of custom alert people set for messages they don't want to sit on. He looked at the screen, looked up at the room, and looked back at the screen, put the phone in his pocket. She thought about who might be texting Derek Mason at 8:17 on a Saturday evening. She didn't know the answer, but she logged it, filed it under things that are useful to know. 8:22 p.m. And the woman at table 11 flagged him down. She'd been at that table since 7. Late 50s. The kind of jewelry that was tasteful enough to be real and expensive enough to announce itself without trying. And her husband sat beside her, looking at his lap with the studied attention of a man who'd learned that disappearing was the most efficient response to his wife in certain moods. She lifted 2 fingers, and the gesture of someone accustomed to being noticed without having to reach for it. Derek was there in 9 seconds. Maya was 3 tables away, adjusting the position of a bread basket that didn't need adjusting. She couldn't hear the words, but she heard the register and the clipped flat tone of a complaint being delivered by someone who considered the situation beneath them, but it decided to address it anyway, and she saw the direction of the woman's gaze. Table 9. She watched Derek nod and watched his expression arrange itself into sympathetic concern. Eyebrows slightly drawn, lips pressed together. The performance of a man who shared the inconvenience and would personally resolve it. Watched him turn back toward the dining room, and something in her stomach dropped. And, not the soft, anxious drop of worry, the specific physical drop of knowing what's about to happen in the half-second before it happens. The kind of knowing that lives in the body before it reaches the mind. He walked to the center of the floor, not to table 9 first, and to the center. And Maya understood what that meant before he opened his mouth. The center of the floor was a stage. You went to the center when you wanted an audience, and when what you were about to do was meant to be seen. He turned toward her station, Maya Williams. Not loud, never loud. The room was quiet enough, the music low enough, that his voice carried to every table in a 15-foot radius with no visible effort whatsoever, and she was at her station. She set down the order pad she'd been holding. She did not hurry. She walked the way she always walked across this floor, the pace of someone who belonged here and knew it, and wasn't performing anything. And she stopped 2 feet from him. And I've received reports, and Derek said, and that during your service of table 9 this evening, and you made comments to the guest that were unprofessional and inappropriate, and that you said things that caused the guest discomfort. Maya looked at him steadily. I brought him his food. I asked if he needed anything. That's all I said. Multiple guests observed otherwise. Which guests? He didn't answer. Of course he didn't answer. And given this, and Derek continued, and his voice carrying the measured tone of a man performing reluctant duty, and I have no choice but to suspend you pending a full internal review. And please collect your belongings and leave the premises. HR will contact you Monday morning. The words landed the way public words land, with a different weight than private ones, because that was the architecture of what he'd just done. And he'd placed this accusation here, in the center of the room, in front of the tables and the staff and the guests, who were now very clearly no longer having private conversations of their own. And he'd made it public, so that denying it or defending against it required her to perform her defense to an audience that had already been framed to see her as the problem. And it was clean. She had to give him that. She stood in the center of the dining room at Alara's on a Saturday night and looked at Derek Mason and felt beneath the fear and beneath the anger and beneath the cold arithmetic of what losing this job would mean, something unexpected and clarity. The clean, quiet clarity of a person who has done the right thing and cannot be made to undo it. I didn't say anything inappropriate, she said, and quiet, level, and you know that. Derek smiled, the smile of a man who considers the outcome already settled. Please collect your things, Maya. She looked around the room. The servers were busy, remarkably, suddenly, thoroughly busy, and Gwen was rearranging glassware on a tray with close attention. The busboy near the kitchen corridor had found something on his phone that required immediate focus, and Renee at the host stand was studying the reservation book like it contained answers to questions she'd been asking for years. And not one of them looked at her. She scanned the tables. The couple at 7, the group at 3. The woman at 11, who had gotten what she wanted and was now looking at her dessert menu, and a few individual faces that registered awareness of the scene in front of them without registering any intention to respond to it. Nobody moved. Nobody said anything, and she was standing in the center of the room, in a building she'd worked in for 4 years, and she was completely alone in it. And then the sound of a chair, pushed back from a table, unhurried, from the corner by the kitchen door. The man stood up, not fast, not dramatically, and he simply rose from the chair at table 9, the way a person rises when they've decided to be somewhere other than seated, and he stood at his full height, and the room reoriented around him. Something had changed, and it wasn't the posture exactly, though his posture was different now. It wasn't the expression, and it was something less definable. The particular quality of a person who has been present in a room in one capacity and has shifted into another, and the shift is visible even when you can't name the mechanism. She didn't say anything inappropriate, and his voice carried the same way Derek's did, not through volume, through the particular texture of a voice accustomed to being heard without raising itself. She brought my food. She asked if I needed anything. She was professional in every interaction we had. And that is the complete extent of what occurred between us tonight. Derek turned toward him. For the first time since the man had walked through the door, Maya watched Derek look at him with something other than contempt or calculation, and something that arrived at the edge of his composure and tested it. Uncertainty. Sir, this is an internal staffing matter. You made it a public one, still even, still unhurried. You made a public accusation in front of a full dining room. And that means it stopped being internal the moment you opened your mouth. A pause. Who are you? Derek said. The man reached down and removed his left shoe. The 4 tables nearest to him leaned back. A collective, instinctive recoil, the braced anticipation of something unpleasant. But what followed wasn't unpleasant, it was confusing. And they watched a man press his thumb along the interior of the sole and find a seam and apply pressure at a specific point. and remove from a hollowed compartment a phone so slim it might have been part of the shoe's construction. And he set it on the table, pressed a button, set it face down, looked at Derek, and waited. The room had gone quiet in the way rooms go quiet when they sense that what is happening in front of them is not a scene that will resolve quickly. 15 seconds, 20, 30, and the front door of Illara's opened. A woman came in first. She was in her early 50s, dark-skinned, and the kind of posture that suggested she had never in her life been in a room where she didn't belong. Not because she'd never been unwelcome, but because she'd decided a long time ago that belonging was not something other people got to grant or withhold. And she wore a charcoal dress and low heels, and an expression that was professional, the way organized weather systems are professional, purposeful, not interested in anything that wasn't directly relevant to what she'd come here to do. And behind her, two men in dark suits carrying briefcases, moving with the practiced efficiency of people who'd done this before and knew how long it took. And behind them, and a woman in plain clothes, maybe 40 years old, and with a leather badge on a lanyard, and the particular gait of someone who had spent years walking toward situations that other people were walking away from. And they crossed the dining room floor without stopping, without looking around at the tables or the guests or the decor, without any of the usual adjustments people make when they enter a space that's designed to impress. And the woman in charcoal stopped near the center of the room and looked around once. A single, complete, unhurried survey. Then she turned to address the room, and her voice was warm and precise in equal measure. I apologize for the interruption this evening. And my name is Claire Whitfield. I serve as executive assistant to James Whitfield, founder and principal owner of Illara Group, which includes this restaurant and 11 additional locations. 1 full second of complete silence. Then the room moved, not loudly. And this was not a crowd given to volume, but Maya heard it. The collective exhale of 40 people recalibrating simultaneously. Glasses being set down with care, a chair shifting, conversations dropping away mid-sentence. The woman at table 11 had put down her dessert menu, and her husband had looked up from his lap. Maya stood exactly where she was, and felt something in her chest, something that had been pulled tight since she'd stood in that restroom, holding a piece of paper. Release. Not completely. Not yet. But enough to take a full breath, and Derek had not moved. He was still standing in the center of the floor where he'd positioned himself to make a spectacle of her, and now the room had reorganized itself around him. And he was at the middle of something he had not designed and could not dismantle. And she watched him understand this, watched it arrive in stages. The initial confusion, which lasted less than a second, the recalculation, which took longer. Then the attempt to reassemble the composure that had carried him through 6 years of managing this room. And he was good at reassembling composure. He'd had considerable practice, but his hands gave him away. He'd put them in his pockets. He didn't do that. Not usually, and people put their hands in their pockets when they need to put them somewhere, and Derek Mason always knew exactly what to do with his hands. James Whitfield stepped forward. He was still wearing the faded brown jacket, still unshaven, still in the shoes with the compartment in the sole, and he walked across the dining room floor of his own restaurant with the ease of a man who had walked into difficult rooms for 3 decades and had long since stopped needing to announce himself in order to be heard. And I've been recording since I walked through the door tonight, he said. Every conversation audible from my position, and every interaction with staff. He stopped a few feet from Derek. Would you like to tell me what's wrong with the meal I was served this evening, or would you prefer I tell you? Derek shook his head. His voice was still good, still almost steady, and I don't know what you're referring to. The dry-aged ribeye at table 9, plated at approximately 7:52 this evening, left at room temperature for 4 hours following the lunch service before being returned to refrigeration and then retrieved for use tonight. And several people at nearby tables pushed their own plates slightly back. That's a serious accusation, Derek said, and it's false. And whatever you think you heard, and whatever you think you know, what I know, and James said, and came from this building, and from a conversation that occurred in this building at approximately 7:18 this evening. Any recording made without explicit consent is. Georgia operates under one-party consent, said one of the suited men behind Claire. He didn't look up from the document he was reading. and said it the way you'd read an expiration date off a carton. Just information, just fact. Derek's mouth closed, opened, closed again. The woman with the badge stepped forward. Detective Selena Ford had a way of occupying space that was neither aggressive nor deferential. And she simply was where she was, and she was there completely, and she'd brought a folder. My name is Selena Ford. I'm a licensed private investigator retained by Elara Group's legal team 22 days ago to conduct a financial review of this location. And she opened the folder and placed 3 pages on the nearest empty table without looking at them. During the course of that investigation, I identified a secondary matter unrelated to the original financial scope. She looked at Derek, and over a period of approximately 3 weeks, I documented a series of communications between Derek Mason and a representative of Hartwell Dining Group. And the subject of those communications was the proposed sale of a data package containing personal information belonging to approximately 2,400 of Elara Group's top-tier clients, and names, contact information, dining histories, business affiliations. The agreed price for that package was $200,000. The dining room had gone to a quality of silence Maya had never heard in it before. The silence of a room that is not breathing, and the exchange was scheduled for tonight, Ford continued. The Hartwell representative arrived at this address at 8:05 p.m. He has been asked to remain outside until law enforcement arrives. Derek turned, looked at the exit, and one member of the security team that had come in with Claire was standing near the door, not blocking it, not making any visible effort, just standing in the particular locations that made the geometry of the room clear to anyone who was thinking about geometry. And additionally, Ford said, the financial review produced documentation of systematic irregularities in vendor invoicing and inventory reporting at this location spanning 6 years. And the estimated total of those discrepancies is in the range of $340,000. And she closed the folder. Atlanta PD was notified at 8:15. Officers are en route, somewhere at a distance that was getting less distant. Sirens, or possibly Maya's pulse. She genuinely could not tell. Derek's face had traveled somewhere she hadn't seen it go before. Through composure. Out the other side. Not to panic. He didn't have the architecture for open panic. But to a stillness that was imposed rather than chosen. The stillness of a man who has run every calculation available to him and found that none of them produce a usable outcome. And he looked at James. You constructed this, he said, quietly. The warmth entirely gone now, and what was left underneath it was flat and cold and oddly without texture. And you walked in here dressed like that, and you created a situation. And you recorded without disclosure. I walked into my restaurant, and James said, and dressed in a way that your staff responded to in a specific manner. That is the complete description of what I did. You wanted a reaction. I wanted to understand what kind of place I was running, and a pause. Now I understand. I have given 6 years to this location, Derek said, and something in his voice had shifted again. An attempt at something. Not quite indignation, not quite appeal, something in between that had no clean name. And 6 years of building this floor, building these numbers, building a reputation, and taking considerably more than 6 years' worth of what didn't belong to you. James's voice didn't change, didn't harden, didn't rise, and it stayed exactly where it was, which was somehow worse than if it had moved. And from the inventory accounts, from the vendor relationships, from 2,400 clients who trusted this restaurant with their personal information. From the staff you've been managing through financial coercion. He didn't look at Maya when he said that, but she heard it, and from the staff you've been managing through financial coercion. At the kitchen corridor door, Tobias had gone very still. Derek tried one more thing. She recognized it when it started. She'd seen him do it before, in smaller situations, and when a difficult table needed managing. When a supplier pushed back on terms, he turned away from James, turned toward the room, not toward anyone specific, toward the general population of witnesses, ladies and gentlemen. His voice found the warmth again, somehow, and the way a performer finds a character in the wings before walking out regardless of what's happening in their actual life. I want to assure each of you that what is being alleged tonight represents a significant mischaracterization of Derek, and just his name. From James, no other instruction attached to it. Derek stopped. No one in this room is listening to that right now, James said. Not unkind, not triumphant. Simply accurate, the way a person states a fact about the weather, and it was true. Maya looked at the room, and at the faces. Nobody was listening, nobody was going to listen. And the moment for that kind of performance had passed, and everyone in the room felt it, and Derek, and who was very good at reading rooms, and felt it too. And he stood there for a moment, and then the thing she'd never seen before happened. Derek Mason ran out of moves. She'd have thought, if she'd imagined this moment before tonight, that watching him run out of moves would feel like something. Satisfaction, relief, and some form of emotional conclusion. It didn't feel like anything in particular, and he was just a man standing in the middle of a room that had turned around him, and he was out of things to say, and outside the sirens were getting closer, and none of it changed what he'd done or put back what he'd taken or fixed the 6 years of it, and she looked away from him. Tobias was still standing at the kitchen corridor. He hadn't moved since Claire had walked in, and he'd stayed exactly where he was, at the edge of the kitchen door, watching the room the way a person watches when they know they're part of what's being described and don't yet know what to do about it. Maya looked at him. He looked back at her, and he had the face of a man in the middle of a decision. And not a comfortable decision. Not the kind you make because all the options are good and you're choosing the best one. The kind you make because all the options hurt and you're choosing which hurt you can live with. She knew that face. She'd worn it in a restroom 40 minutes ago, and she held his gaze for a moment. She didn't nod, didn't say anything. She just looked at him with the look of someone who had already been to the place he was standing at the edge of, and had gone, and was still there. And he looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at the floor. Then he looked at James Whitfield, standing in the center of the room in his old jacket and his modified shoes, holding the weight of the evening with the ease of someone who'd been carrying harder things for longer than most people knew. And Tobias stepped forward from the kitchen doorway. Nobody had called him. Nobody had asked. And he just walked out into the dining room, and still in his apron, and stopped near the middle of the floor. And when he spoke, his voice was unsteady in the way voices are unsteady, when a person is frightened and doing the thing anyway. And Derek Mason told me to use a ribeye from the lunch service return, he said. The piece had been left at room temperature for approximately 4 hours before it was put back in the cooler. Derek told me to retrieve it and plate it for table 9. He stopped, steadied himself, and he said the man at that table was unlikely to complain in any way that anyone would take seriously. He used those words. Tobias paused, and he reminded me of a financial arrangement he had in place over my employment, and that was how he got me to agree. He looked at Maya when he finished. Not at James, not at Derek, not at the legal team or the detective or the room full of people watching this unfold. At Maya. And she understood what that meant. And he wasn't speaking because James had compelled him. He wasn't speaking because the situation had left him no other choice. He was speaking because she had gone first, and because she had done the thing alone, with everything at stake and nothing guaranteed. And he had watched her do it, and then stood in the kitchen for 40 minutes, not being the person he wanted to be. And this was him deciding to be that person. It had taken him 40 minutes. She didn't fault him for the 40 minutes. She knew what 40 minutes like that cost. She held his gaze and nodded. Once, small. The nod that meant, see you. That's enough. And 2 officers came through the front door at 8:41 p.m. No commotion, no dramatic entrance, and just 2 people in uniform walking across the floor with the measured pace of professionals who'd done this kind of thing before and knew that the most effective version of authority was the quiet kind. And Claire met them near the entrance and spoke to them briefly, handing over a copy of the folder Ford had brought. They listened, nodded, walked toward Derek. Derek watched them come. He didn't fight it, didn't make a speech, didn't appeal to the room again. And he'd run the calculation, she could see it, and he'd found what was already true. There was nothing left to do that would change the outcome. The documentation was in their hands. The recording existed, and Ford had 3 weeks of surveillance. Tobias had spoken. The only thing left was the geometry of what happened next. He put his hands forward, and that was the last thing Maya saw of Derek Mason. His hands going forward, the cuffs, and the small, formal sound of the mechanism closing. And his face, when the officer turned him toward the door, was composed in a way that was almost convincing, and except for his hands, and which were still in the wrong position. and the position of a man who'd needed somewhere to put them. And he walked out. The room watched him go, and then the room exhaled. Guests began gathering their things. The legal team moved through the tables efficiently, offering cards and quiet explanations. Refunds would be processed in full, and the restaurant would be closed for the remainder of the evening. Information about the incident would be communicated through proper channels. And if any guest had specific concerns or had consumed food this evening that was causing worry, there was a number to call, and Maya stood at her station. Her legs were still holding her up. She was somewhat surprised by this. The adrenaline had been keeping her in motion for the last 40 minutes, and now the motion was stopping, and she was discovering what was underneath it. Tired. Just tired. And not dramatic, not collapsed, not overwhelmed in any visible way. Just the bone-level exhaustion of a person who has been running on intention for a long time and has finally been allowed to stop. And Gwen passed her on the way to the break room and paused, looked at her, opened her mouth, closed it, walked on. Maya didn't need her to say it. She knew what the look meant. And something between apology and acknowledgement and the complicated guilt of someone who had watched and not moved. She'd felt that guilt herself in different situations, about different choices. She understood it. She didn't have space for it right now, and she began clearing table 7, plates and glasses onto a tray, and napkins folded. Habit. The automatic function of hands that knew their work. Ms. Williams. She set down the glass she was holding. Claire Whitfield was standing the edge of her section. Up close, the quality she'd noticed from across the room was even more apparent. And not hardness, not severity, just the particular steadiness of a person who has been someone's most trusted resource for a long time and has learned that steadiness is the most valuable thing she can offer in a crisis. And Mr. Whitfield would like to speak with you, Claire said. When you're ready, there's no urgency. Maya looked at her for a moment. The man who was sitting at table 9, she said. Yes, she thought about what there was to say to that. And about the man who had walked in wearing a jacket with worn elbows and sat at the worst table in the room, with the posture of someone who'd sat at a great many rooms and hadn't been diminished by any of them. And give me a few minutes, she said. Claire nodded. Of course. Maya finished clearing the table. She carried the tray to the kitchen, set it on the pass-through, and stood there for a moment, with her hands on the steel surface, looking at the kitchen she'd walked in and out of 4,000 times, give or take. The kitchen where Tobias had plated that food with his hands shaking, and the kitchen where she'd stood behind a spice rack and heard a man instruct another man to make someone sick, and she stood there for a moment. Let the kitchen be what it was, a kitchen, just a kitchen. Then she went back out to the floor. James Whitfield was sitting at a table by the window. He'd moved from table 9, and he was still in the jacket, still unshaven, and he was looking out the window at the street with the expression of a man who has a great deal to look at in a very small window and is taking his time with it. And he looked up when she approached. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. They sat across from each other at a table by the window. Outside, the street was doing what streets do at 9 o'clock on a Saturday in the city. People moving in pairs and small groups, and a cab pulling away from the curb. The distant sound of something that might have been music from a block over, too faint to identify. Inside, Alara's was emptying, and the legal team moved through the room with quiet efficiency. A few remaining guests gathered their things and spoke to Claire near the entrance. 2 staff members Maya didn't know well were stacking chairs at the far end of the floor, and the overhead lights had been dimmed to the level used for closing, which made the whole room feel like a different place. Smaller, more honest, somehow, than it looked when it was full. James Whitfield was looking at the window, and Maya was looking at her hands, which were folded on the table in front of her. Still, she'd stopped from doing anything. No order pad, no water carafe, no tray to carry. Just her hands folded and the table between them. He didn't open with a question, and he didn't open with anything. He just sat there looking at the window with the ease of a man who had learned that silence was not an emergency and didn't need to be filled, and she appreciated that more than she could have said. After a while, he said, "You've been on your feet since noon, not a question, just an observation." 5, she said. "Noon is when the lunch crew comes in. I'm dinner. Since 5 then. Since 5. And he nodded, like he was adding it to something he was already calculating. Another silence. This one's into a different texture. Not the silence of two people who had nothing to say, and the silence of two people who had things to say and were deciding how. You knew, he said, when you wrote that note. You knew what it would cost you if Derek found out. I knew what it would cost me either way, Maya said. One cost was a job. The other cost was something else. And he looked at her then, away from the window. What was the other cost? She looked back at him. Myself, she said. And if I'd walked past that table and let that man eat that food, and gone home and paid my bills and told myself it wasn't my problem, that's what it would have cost. James was quiet for a moment. Most people make that trade, he said. Not a judgment, and just a fact, delivered the way he seemed to deliver most things. Without excess. I know, Maya said. I understand why I almost did. What stopped you? She thought about how to answer that, and not because she didn't know, because she was deciding how much of the knowing to give him. My mother, she said finally. She was a nurse, 28 years. She was asked once to alter a patient's record, something small, and the kind of small that protects the person with power and leaves the patient with nothing they can point to. She refused. What happened to her? She lost her job, not all at once, slowly, the way those things happen, and fewer hours, worse assignments, until she didn't have a reason to stay anymore, and she never said she wished she'd done it differently. Not once. I was with her for a long time before she passed, and she never said it. Maya paused. I thought about that, in the restroom, and when I was deciding. James looked at her for a long moment. Then he did something she hadn't expected. He reached forward and turned his left hand over on the table, wrist up, and the scar was there, pale and long, running from below his thumb in a diagonal line that had softened over the years without disappearing. He didn't explain it. He just let it be visible. She looked at it. Atlanta, he said. I was 23, and I was going through the alley behind a restaurant. The back door opened. He paused, not for effect, just because that was where the pause was. The man who opened it didn't ask any question, and he had a pot of water. Maya said nothing. It was January, he said. I remember that. I was very cold before it happened, and then I wasn't cold anymore, and that was the part that was most disorienting. The heat arrived before I understood what was happening, and he turned his hand back over. The scar went out of sight. I built a Lara group on one thing, he said. Not the food, not the service standards, not the revenue targets. And one thing. Every person who walks through the door is treated with dignity. I held that line across 12 restaurants in 5 cities for 22 years. He looked at the room around them, and tonight, in a building with my name on the lease, they prepared contaminated food to serve to a man they thought had no one to speak for him. Maya followed his gaze around the room. The dimmed lights, the stacked chairs beginning to accumulate at the far end, and the white tablecloths with their rings from glasses, and the small, specific evidence of the evening that had happened here. You've been testing your restaurants, she said. It wasn't a question exactly. This is the 4th time, he said. Different cities, different circumstances. And what happened the other 3 times? Problems, smaller ones, a manager with a temper, a kitchen with hygiene failures, a service structure that allocated care based on how much the bill would come to. He paused, and I fixed them. You didn't expect this. He was quiet for a moment. No, he said. I didn't expect this. She looked at him, at the jacket, at the beard he hadn't shaved, at the shoes sitting on the floor beside his chair, one of them with its secret already revealed. And you read people, he said. I've been doing it my whole life, I know. I watched you tonight. You watch everyone tonight. I watched everyone, he agreed. But I watched you differently. She didn't ask what that meant. She thought she knew. When you brought the water, he said, before any of this, you looked at me in a way that no one else in this room looked at me. Like you'd already decided something about what you were seeing. And I decided you weren't who you were dressed as, she said. What gave it away? She thought about it, how to put language to a thing that had been immediate and wordless. And the way you sat down, she said. People who've been beaten down by the world sit differently, like they're taking up as little space as possible, like they're apologizing for being in the chair. She paused, and you sat like someone who'd been in rooms that mattered more than this one and hadn't needed them to matter more than this one. He was quiet for a moment. That's an accurate description, he said. And your eyes, she said, when you were looking around the room, and you weren't orienting yourself, you were assessing. Those are different things. One of them is what a person does when they're new to a place. The other is what a person does when they already know exactly what they're looking for. And James looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face yet tonight. Not the watchful stillness, not the composed authority. Something that had opened slightly. The expression of a person who has been accurately seen and is deciding how to be with that. And I need to ask you something, he said. All right, why did you come sit down? Just now. When Claire told you I wanted to speak with you. Maya considered the question. Because you stood up when I was standing there alone, she said, in the middle of that room with 40 people watching, and not one of them saying anything. She paused. I wanted to know what kind of person does that. And I'm still finding out, she said. Same as you're still finding out about me. He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. Claire came to the table at 9:47. She didn't interrupt, and she stood at a respectful distance until there was a pause in the conversation, and then moved forward and said quietly, and the police are finished for now, and they'll need formal statements from both of you next week. And Tobias is waiting in the front hall. He'd like to speak with Mr. and Whitfield when there's a moment. James looked at Maya. Do you mind? No, she said. I need some water anyway. She got up and went to the bar and poured herself a glass of water from the tap and stood there drinking it and looking at the back of the room, at the kitchen door, at the corridor where she'd stood behind the spice rack and heard the conversation that had started all of this. 4 hours and 47 minutes ago, and it felt like a different night. She refilled the glass and carried it back to the table and sat down. James was gone. She could see him through the glass panels near the entrance, standing in the front hall with Tobias. She watched them without watching, and the glass of water in her hands, the weight of it. Tobias was talking. His hands were moving, which they did when he was trying to say something precisely and couldn't find the words fast enough. And James was listening the way he listened, which was completely and without visible impatience. After a while, Tobias stopped talking. James said something short. Tobias nodded, then nodded again. He put his hands in his apron pocket. He looked at the floor for a moment, and then he looked up. She couldn't see his face clearly from here, but she could see the angle of his shoulders, and that was enough. The angle of someone who has set something down. She knew that angle, and she'd found it herself sometime in the last 2 hours. She hadn't noticed the exact moment, but it was there now. James came back to the table at 10:02. He sat down, looked at his hands for a moment. He's a good cook, he said. He's a great cook, Maya said. And he's better than this place deserved. I told him that. What else did you tell him? James looked at her, that he has a choice. He can walk away from Alara Group entirely, and I'll make sure it doesn't follow him. Or he can stay and be part of building what this place should have been. What did he say? He said he needed to call his wife first. Maya nodded. That was right. That was exactly right. What about you? James said. She looked at him. What about me? When Alara's reopens, he started, and if, she said, he accepted the correction. If Alara's reopens, and it will, but if it does, I need someone to run it, and someone who understands what it's supposed to be. Not someone who can manage a service standard, someone who understands why the standard exists. Maya was quiet. I'm offering you the position of general manager, he said. Full authority over hiring, training, and operations, and salary and benefits that reflect the responsibility. Health coverage. He paused. Comprehensive health coverage. She looked at the table, at the window, at the room around them, half dark and chair stacked and honest in the way rooms were honest when the performance was over. And can I ask you something? She said. Yes, is this because of tonight? Because of the note? He didn't answer immediately, which she appreciated. It's because of who you are, he said. Tonight showed me who you are, but who you are is what I need, not the act of writing the note. And the person who wrote it. Those are the same thing, she said. I know, he said. That's why I'm asking. She sat with it for a moment. And I want to think about it, she said. Not because I'm not interested, because I don't make decisions like this in the same hour that everything else has happened. That's not how I make decisions. I wouldn't want you to, and he said. Take whatever time you need. She nodded. And then she said, I have one condition. If I say yes, he waited. If I take this job, she said, I want to design the training program for the new staff, and from scratch. Not adapt an existing one. Build it from what I know about what happens in places like this when nobody's watching. That's not a condition, he said. That's a requirement. I was going to ask you regardless. She looked at him. There's one more thing, she said. And tell me, She paused. I want to keep it. Not as a souvenir. I want it framed, somewhere visible when you walk in. So new staff see it on their first day and ask what it is. And he was quiet for a moment. What would you tell them, he said, when they ask? The truth, she said, that someone with nothing to gain and everything to lose decided the right thing was worth the risk. And that's the standard, not the food, not the pricing, not the decor. That. And James looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, yes, just that. The last of the staff left at 10:30. Gwen stopped near the door and looked back at Maya, who was still sitting at the table by the window. And the look again, the complicated one. Maya held it for a moment and then nodded. Small, just enough. Gwen went out. And the room was empty now, except for Maya and Claire, and who was near the entrance doing something quiet and administrative on her phone, and James, and who had gone to stand by the bar and was looking at the room with the expression of someone taking inventory of a different kind than the one he'd arrived to take. And Masaya sat with her water glass and looked at the room too, and she thought about her mother. She thought about what her mother had said in those last months when the words came in shorter supply, and each one had to do more work. About choices, about the weight of them, and about how the right choice and the easy choice were rarely the same thing, and how you had to decide which weight you could carry. And she thought about Deja, and asleep by now in her dorm room, and phone probably face down on the pillow, and hair wrapped, and textbook open to a page she'd stopped reading an hour before she stopped reading it. And she would call her in the morning. She would tell her the whole thing. And Deja would make a sound somewhere between a gasp and a laugh, and ask 17 questions in the wrong order, and Maya would answer them all. And it would take 40 minutes, and she would not mind a single one of them. And she thought about Raymond, not painfully, not with the particular ache that used to come when she thought about him in the first year after, and just with the quiet acknowledgement that he would have had something to say about tonight. Something specific and probably too loud for the room he said it in. He'd been like that. He'd thought that appropriate volume was a suggestion and not a rule. She missed that about him, and she finished the water, set the glass down, got up. Outside, the night air had cooled. She stood on the sidewalk in front of Alara's and looked at the street for a moment, and the cab she'd watched from the window had long since gone. The music from down the block had stopped. A couple walked past without looking at her, deep in a conversation about something that mattered to them. She started walking toward the bus stop. Her phone buzzed. Deja, and she looked at the screen for a second. Then she answered. Hey, she said. Maya, her sister's voice, warm and immediate. I called you like 6 hours ago. I know. And I was at work. You're always at work. What happened? You sound pause. You sound different. Maya walked the sidewalk under her feet, the night air. Something happened tonight, she said. I'll tell you the whole thing. But first, how's the tuition looking? And we can talk about that later, Deja. It's fine, I just wanted, how much? Deja told her. Maya did the math in her head, the fast, automatic math, the math she'd been doing so long it happened without effort. And okay, she said. Okay meaning you have it? Okay meaning I'll have it. Something happened tonight and I'll explain when I see you. But it's okay. I think things are going to be okay. A silence on the line. You really do sound different, Deja said. I am different, Maya said, and a little bit. It was a long night. Good different or bad different? Maya stopped walking for a second, looked up at the sky, which was doing nothing dramatic, and just being the sky, dark and present and full of things too far away to see clearly. Good, she said. I think good. 3 months later, the sign above the door was the same gold script. Elara's, same letters, same font, same restrained elegance. But someone had adjusted the lighting that illuminated it from below, and it was warmer now, less like a statement, and more like an invitation. Maya stood inside the entrance at 5:45 p.m. on a Friday, watching the staff complete their setup, and 15 people, 12 of them new. 3 who had been here before the renovation, Renee among them, standing at the host, stand with a posture that was different from the one she'd had 3 months ago, more settled, and less like she was waiting to be told she'd done something wrong. The room had changed, not dramatically, the bones were the same. The chandeliers, the dark walls, the white tablecloths, but the tables were spaced differently, and with more room between them, and the lighting was warmer throughout. And there was nothing in the arrangement that said, and prove you deserve to be here. And the kitchen had new protocols. Tobias had written most of them, and he'd come back. And after a week of conversations with Claire and a longer conversation with Brianna, and who had said, and according to Tobias, and that she didn't marry a man who hid in kitchens, and the protocols were thorough and specific, and had the quality of something written by a person who understood from the inside what they were trying to prevent. Maya had added the training component, 12 new staff members, 6 sessions over 4 weeks, and not about service standards, about people, about what it meant to have someone walk through a door and be in your care for 2 hours, regardless of what they looked like or what they were wearing or what the bill was going to come to. And she'd told them, in the second session, about her mother. She hadn't planned to. It came up in a conversation about why standards existed and who they were for. And she'd started talking and found she didn't want to stop. And when she finished, the room was quiet in the way. Rooms were quiet when something had landed. And a woman named Petra, who was going to be excellent at this job, asked a question about it that kept them talking for another 40 minutes. And she'd told James about that session. He'd listened without interrupting, which was what he did. Then he'd said, that's exactly what I needed. And she'd found over 3 months of weekly calls and occasional in-person meetings that James Whitfield was a specific kind of person. Not an easy one. He was demanding in the way that people were demanding when they cared deeply about the thing they were demanding it for. And he had opinions about nearly everything related to the restaurant and stated them clearly. And then listened when she disagreed, and which she did, and regularly. And because she had opinions too, and she'd decided early on that she hadn't taken this job to be agreed with. And he'd told her once, in a call that had run long, that she was the only person in his professional life who consistently told him when he was wrong. She'd said, Claire tells you when you're wrong. He'd said, Claire is diplomatic about it. You're not. And she'd said, you're paying me to run a restaurant, not to manage your feelings. He'd laughed. A real one. She'd filed that away. The laugh of a man who didn't laugh often enough. And at 5:55, the front door was unlocked. At 6:00, the first guests arrived. Maya moved through the early service with her hands behind her back and her eyes on the room, not supervising exactly, present, available. There was a difference, and at 6:40, a couple at table 5 flagged Renee with a question about the menu. Renee handled it. Checked in briefly with Maya after. Maya said, you didn't need to check with me, but good instinct on the wine recommendation, and Renee nodded, went back to her station. At 7:15, Tobias sent a plate back from the kitchen because the temperature wasn't right, and the server who'd taken it, and a young man named Darius, who was 3 weeks into the job, and started to argue briefly, and then didn't, and then went back and told the table it would be a few minutes, and he came to find Maya afterward. I wanted to push back, he said, on Tobias, because the table was already waiting. And, why didn't you? Because you said in training that the food is the floor. Everything else is built on top of it. If the floor's wrong, nothing else matters. What do you think about that now? He thought about it, and I think the table waited 4 more minutes, and the food was right, and nobody complained. That's about right, Maya said. He went back to his section. At 7:58, the door opened, and Maya's was near the bar, speaking to the bartender about a wine question she'd fielded earlier, and she heard the door. Didn't look up immediately. Finished the sentence she was in. Then she looked. A man stood just inside the entrance. His jacket was olive green and worn at the collar. His shoes had seen a long time. He was carrying a canvas bag over one shoulder, and he had the posture of someone who had spent so long expecting to be turned away from places that the expectation had become part of how he stood. Shoulders slightly forward, and chin slightly down, taking up as little space as possible. He looked around and found Maya looking back at him. Renee was already moving from the host stand. Maya got there first. Welcome to Alara's, she said. He looked at her, waited. Table for one, she said. And, or are you meeting someone? He stopped, started again. I don't have much money. I walked past and I saw the light on and he stopped again. We have a community menu, Maya said, and for guests who need it. It's the same kitchen, same food, different price point. He stared at her. I don't understand, he said. It means you're welcome here, she said. Come in. She led him to a table by the window, the one she'd sat at with James 3 months ago, and she gave him the community menu, which was a clean card with 4 options, and no prices listed because there were no prices. She brought him water without being asked. and when she stepped back from the table, Renee was watching from the host stand. Maya met her eyes. Renee nodded, turned back to her station. Maya walked to the far side of the room, toward the entrance, where she stopped at a small frame mounted on the wall near the door, and it had gone up on the first day of renovation. She'd requested it. James had said yes before she finished asking. Inside the frame was a piece of paper, and folded twice, and then unfolded. The crease is permanent now, the paper slightly worn at the corners. The handwriting was cramped and quick and slightly uneven, the writing of a person who was in a hurry and had one chance to get it right. Don't eat. The meat is bad, and left out for hours. They know. Below the paper, a small plaque. She'd written the words herself, sent them to James for approval. He'd sent them back unchanged. Every person who walks through this door deserves dignity, and not as a reward, not as a privilege, as a minimum. This note was written by someone with everything to lose and nothing to gain. And it was written in a bathroom with no camera, with a pen and a scrap of paper, by a person who understood that the right choice and the easy choice are rarely the same thing. It changed what happened next. So can you. Maya Reeves, general manager. And she stood in front of it for a moment, and new staff read it on their first day. She made sure of that. She didn't explain it to them, not at first. She let them read it, and then she watched their faces, and then she asked them what they thought it meant. The answers varied, but the question never did, and that was the point. She turned away from the frame. The man by the window was looking at the menu. His shoulders had come up slightly, not all the way, but some. The forward lean had eased. Darius was approaching his table with a bread basket, and the kind of easy smile of someone who was good at making people feel like their presence was the most natural thing in the world. Maya watched him set it down, watched the man look up, and watched Darius say something that made the man's expression shift, just slightly, from braced to something else. Something that had been underneath the braced for a while, probably, and was finding a little room to surface. And she thought about her mother, about a woman who had refused to alter a record, and lost her job, and never once said it wasn't worth it, and about Deja, and who had driven down from Athens last weekend with 3 friends and a cake, and sat in the back booth of the not-yet-open restaurant eating it off paper plates. While Maya finished training session and had hugged her at the end of the night and said "Lock and" into her shoulder, "And I'm so proud of you," and about Raymond, who would have had something too loud to say about all of it, and whose loudness she missed in a way that had softened from sharp to something she could carry. And she thought about a Tuesday morning 3 months ago, when she'd sat at her kitchen table with the red striped envelopes in front of her and her sister's voicemail unanswered, and had put on her uniform and braided her hair and gone to work. And she didn't sit at that table the same way anymore, and the envelopes were gone. The 2 chairs were still both hers, but the weight that used to live at that table had shifted, not disappeared. She was not a person who believed in weights disappearing. She believed in carrying them differently, in distributing them, and in understanding what they were made of and what they were for. The man by the window said something to Darius. Darius nodded, went to get something. The man looked out the window. His shoulders were up, and not all the way, but enough. Maya turned and walked back toward the center of the floor. The room was 3/4 full now, the low music, the warm light, the sound of people in conversation with each other, and the particular texture of an evening that was going the way evenings were supposed to go. Not perfectly. There was no such thing as perfectly, but honestly, with care. A guest at table 3 raised a hand. Maya was already moving toward them. This was the work, and it has always been the work. And tonight, for the first time in longer than she could specifically recall, the work felt like something she had chosen.